Hi everyone! In the next few videos we're going to discuss chapters 5 and 6. I'm combining those two chapters into one big set of lecture videos because there's a lot of overlap between the two chapters. The chapters both have to do with experiments. So let's jump right in and get started. In this particular set of slides you're going to learn about a lot of different terms and concepts that go along with experimental design. You'll learn about different types of experimental designs, and we'll just practice applying the different concepts and ideas to some real problems. So I just quickly wanted to remind you about something that we talked about earlier in the semester. How we gather our data matters. This comes up right away in chapter 1 when you're learning about the distinction or the difference between observational studies and experiments. So remember, if we have an observational study, we're just observing individuals generally and kind of just naturally what they would normally do. We measure certain variables of interest as we're observing. We're not trying to intervene or affect the situation in any way or influence what's going on, so we're just standing back and watching. And we've talked about examples of that. So if you survey individuals, if you're trying to find out their opinions or attitudes, that would be one type of observational study. What we're getting into now in chapters 5 and 6 is what an experiment is. So an experiment is a situation where you're deliberately imposing a treatment. You're attempting to control the situation in some way. You're attempting to control different variables that could affect a response, because your whole reason for having an experiment or designing an experiment is usually because there's one particular variable or maybe more than one variable that you think has an effect on a response, and you're trying to determine if that's actually the case. So there's a treatment that you might be imposing, and you're trying to see if that treatment is going to cause a change in a response. So if we've been able to design an experiment, a good experiment, at the end of the experiment, we can reach a conclusion about cause and effect. And we'll talk more about that as we go along here. So one thing that you're learning about in chapter 5 is the distinction between an explanatory variable and a response variable. And we just want to make sure that you know the difference between those terms. You're going to see those terms a lot. We use these terms not just with experiments, but with observational studies as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you three different questions that all are based on actual news reports. And in each one, I want you to see if you can identify what the explanatory variable would be and what the response variable would be. So before we actually talk about the definitions of these terms, I just want to see what you might already know about these based on the reading that you've already done in chapter 5. So let me just show you the three things quickly, and you might want to pause this and just write down what you think for each one the explanatory variable is and what the response variable is. And then you can come back and see what the actual answers are. So the first question, can eating a yogurt a day cause you to lose weight? So our response, what we're interested in measuring, is weight loss. So weight loss would be the response. And the explanatory variable, what we think affects the weight loss, is eating yogurt. For the second one, do males find females more attractive if the females wear red? So what is it that we're measuring? What is the outcome of the study? So we want to know some sort of measure of attractiveness. That's the outcome. What do we think affects that? Wearing red. So if you're wearing red, are you thought to be more attractive than maybe if you're not wearing red? And finally, does reading fiction make people nicer? So again, the response is the outcome, what we're measuring at the end of the study. The explanatory variable is what we think affects that outcome. So here, being nice, some measure of niceness would be our response. And reading fiction would be the explanatory variable. And I have links here in case you are really interested in one of these particular questions, one of these particular studies. You can read more. It turns out, based on the research, that the answers to all these questions, the answer is yes to all the questions. But again, is the research good or bad? I'll let you decide that. Hopefully you'll go and learn a little bit more about these studies. Okay, so again, important terminology. What's coming up? So we've already sort of touched on this in the last slide. So the response is the outcome of a study. Sometimes in an experimental situation, we'll call a response an independent variable. So if you've studied psychology, you maybe have heard the term independent variable, oh, I'm sorry, that's wrong. I'm glad I caught that. The response is the dependent variable. So I'm just making sure you're paying attention here. Okay, the response depends on something. It's the outcome of our study. So again, sometimes we'll use the word dependent variable, sometimes we'll use the word response variable. The explanatory variable is, again, what we think is going to cause a particular response, or we think it's going to affect a particular response. It might not necessarily be a causal relationship that we're talking about, but it's something we think explains or possibly causes a response. And again, sometimes in an experimental setting, this will be called an independent variable. And you might have multiple independent variables. You might just have one. In a lot of the studies that we're going to talk about in chapters 5 and 6, we generally will just have one explanatory variable and one response variable. There's also this idea of treatment. So a treatment would be an experimental condition that's applied to subjects. It could be that maybe we have one particular explanatory variable and we might call that a treatment. We could have a combination of different explanatory variables and that's our treatment. So we'll see some examples of these things as we go along in this set of lecture videos. Finally, there's this idea of lurking variables. So a lurking variable is something that has not been controlled for by the researcher. It's something that could affect the relationship between the explanatory and response variable. It's not one of the explanatory variables. It's not really something that we necessarily want to have in the study. And because it's there, it might make it harder for us to know if it's the explanatory variable that's leading to a response, or could it be possibly this lurking variable. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we can try to control for those lurking variables so that we can be more confident that it's actually the explanatory variable that's leading to our response. And I found, so I really want you to be able to visualize a lot of these different things. And I was thinking about, is there something that could maybe help us visualize what a lurking variable is? That whenever you hear that term, that you could kind of just imagine this in your mind. And again, a lurking variable is something bad. It's kind of lurking in the background. We don't want it there. It's not going to do good things for us. We want to try to get rid of it or control for it so that it's not having an impact. Here's something I found that I thought maybe would be a good visual representation of this. So this is a lurking variable. It's bad. It's looming in the background. It's not going to do good things. So we want to try to get rid of that. And we'll talk about how we can attempt to get rid of these lurking variables, or at least keep them at bay so that we can try to get a better understanding of how the explanatory variable is actually affecting our response. Now, what you're going to be reading about in Chapter 5, we have these 3 different principles of experimental design. And I wanted to avoid just sort of listing the principles and describing the principles. In the past, I've just kind of had a long list of them, and I'll tell you about them. What I wanted to do is sort of break that list up, talk about each one separately, and give some examples along the way to try to highlight what these principles are all about so that you'll hopefully better understand them. So there are 3 main principles. The very first one is control. So in an experiment, a big thing that we do is we try to control for the effects of lurking variables on the response. So what we want to do is we want to create a situation in our experiment where we have maybe 2 or more groups that are similar at the start of our study, similar in terms of all the possible lurking variables that could be coming into play, and we then want to impose a treatment. So we really want to set up a situation where if we're comparing different groups, the only thing that's really different among those groups is the treatment. Everything else is kept similar as possible. And then we can compare the 2 or more treatments on a particular response, and if we see a difference, we can be more confident that it's because of that treatment, because of that manipulation, that we did as an experimenter and not because of these other lurking variables that we didn't control for. So how do you actually go about doing this? And so I didn't mean to show everything on this slide right away, but let me just tell you about a particular study. So some of you, again, maybe like to eat healthy, like to try different types of diets. So there's a Mediterranean diet out there. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a diet that's rich with vegetables, fruits, fish, nuts, and olive oil, as you see in the first bullet point here. So in 2013, there was a study that was published that made some claims about this diet. So in particular, they mentioned, and I have a link here if you'd like to go and try to find the original study if you're interested. They made this claim that if you eat this diet or if you follow this diet, lots of great things could happen for you. It'll lower the risk of a heart attack, stroke, or death from heart disease by 30%. And so, especially in those who are at high risk for these types of ailments or issues. So the study had a pretty large sample, a total of almost 7,500 individuals. They were in Spain, so this was conducted in Spain, and they were followed for 5 years. And what was mentioned in the original article, they indicated that they assigned, we assume randomly, they assigned individuals to one of 3 diets. So they wanted to compare these 3 different groups. One was a Mediterranean diet, which was supplemented with extra virgin olive oil. The other was a Mediterranean diet with mixed nuts. And then they were comparing that to just a simple low-fat diet. And again, what did they find? Well, those in the Mediterranean diet groups performed better, had lower risk of these different issues than those who just followed a simple low-fat diet. So maybe think here about, what kind of possible lurking variables would you want to be controlling for? So we are trying to see if diet has an effect on different health issues. And so what are other things that could affect whether you have different health issues? We could probably come up with a pretty long list. Maybe genetics, the environment that you live in, exercise that you're getting, perhaps your age. So again, we could probably come up with a lot of different things that could affect whether you have particular health issues, whether you're smoking or not, whether you're maybe engaging in other lifestyle choices that are not particularly healthy for you on top of what you eat. So lots of things. So we would want to try to control for those things. And one way that we can try to control for those things in an experiment is to randomly assign people to different groups. So if I randomly assign individuals to one of these 3 groups, hopefully I'm mixing up all of those lurking variables in a similar way in each group. So each group is starting out similarly in terms of different ages, different lifestyle choices that people are engaging in, different genetic factors. So we have a kind of a similar mix of those in each group. So we're starting out with kind of a similar baseline, and then we're applying this treatment, and then we're seeing if that treatment is having an impact on the response. So that would be our way of attempting to control for all of those different lurking variables, just trying to mix them up in a similar way into each of our groups. Now, there was actually a problem with this study. So one of the reasons that this kind of made it into the headlines is that some other researchers later on were looking at the data and looking at the study, and they realized there were some problems in terms of the conclusions that were reached by the original researchers. So what turned out to have happened is that there really was not random assignment to the groups. So it was initially thought that people were just randomly assigned to receive a different diet. That really wasn't the case. And there's a link here where you can read a little bit more about this study and the critiques of this study. So they talk about the fact, this is just a quick quote from the article, but they talk about the fact that people in the same household were sometimes assigned to the same diets. There was one case where, like a whole village, they all were assigned to have the same diet. And so all these other things could be going on that are having an impact on whether there are health issues other than just the diet. So They talk about how, you know, if you're in a family and you all are having the same diet, do we really know that it's the diet alone that's leading to the response, or could it be other family issues or environmental issues that are affecting the health issues that you end up seeing or not seeing? I hope that all made sense. But because this was such a big deal, because there was such a huge flaw in the experiment and the conclusions that the researchers had originally reached, they came back and they actually withdrew their original report and kind of came back and did another study and tried to correct for some of the problems that they initially made in terms of the random assignment. Okay, so that's our first particular principle of experimental design, control. Random assignment is something that helps us control. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about that in our next video.